So the hot topic this month in Palo Alto has been SB 50, the California State Housing Bill that proposes greater densification around transit corridors and job-rich cities. So here to help our viewers understand the implications of SB 50, Palo Alto Vice Mayor Adrian Fine and Vice Chair of the Santa Clara Human Rights Commission, Greer Stone, and you have opposing views on SB 50, and so we'll unpack those as we go. I thought we would start by just having maybe a minute each for you to explain kind of the main reasons why you hold the views that you do. And Adrian, can we start with you?
Sure. So thank you guys for having me. Greer, nice to chat with you here.
Same here.
So I'm supportive of SB 50 with amendments because I think it provides affordable, abundant, and secure housing for people of all generations and all income backgrounds. I think that's one of the hot topics in Palo Alto. We've seen repeatedly in our national citizen survey that people care about housing affordability and availability. I do say, though, that it does need some amendments, and I'm happy to get into those with you later. And I think by supporting the bill, we actually have a better chance of seeing those amendments come to fruition. I'll point out, Palo Alto is a very wealthy city. It is a city that values its neighborhoods, its schools, and it's a great place to call home. But we can't be a progressive city if we aren't welcoming to folks of different incomes and backgrounds here. And so SB 50, I think, does the right thing from an economic, environmental, and equity perspective in terms of focusing housing development near transit and jobs.
Okay, sounds good. Greer, how about you?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate having the opportunity. For me, I think SB 50 advocates really for a deregulatory, kind of trickle-down framework for housing policies that really do more harm than good. I really have two major concerns with SB 50. One is the impact it will have on displacing low-income communities as well as communities of color. It's really been supported by a lot of studies that are starting to come about across the country, as well as the affordability price. Vice Mayor Fine talked about the affordability piece. I think a lot of studies are starting to show that the impact that upzoning has, especially the blanket upzoning that SB 50 will have, will actually cause the affordability that will cause the value of land to increase, causing the price of housing to actually go up, not go down. Also, the attack on local authority, I think, is kind of the antithesis to the system of government that we want to be able to have within the United States, within the state of California as well. I think it really creates a dangerous precedent going forward to have the state mandating and controlling what cities can do on something as important to city government as the ability to control our own zoning, and that impact, that threat it will have on single-family neighborhoods across the city.
Quick question on affordability for Greer. Since you just mentioned that you think this is going to actually increase prices, the latest version of the bill does have an inclusionary housing kind of requirement, depending on both the project size and kind of the income level that it would support. So does it not mean that if this does have a big effect and there's a lot of housing does get built, there will be affordable housing because of these requirements?
Well, no, I think the amount of inclusionary zoning is completely inadequate. I mean, it would only occur for housing units that are 20 units or larger. So underneath that, especially under 10 units, no affordable housing needs to be built, and no affordable funding needs to be provided.
Do you think, Adrian, that there's enough inclusionary housing requirements in the bill right now to kind of support the kind of diversity of income levels that you'd like to see?
So I actually agree with Mr. Stone that under 20 units, you probably should still have an affordability requirement, and the state should be testing how high those affordability thresholds should go, right, on the bigger projects as well. But it's pretty well understood that, cities are having a hard time producing affordable housing, and the best way to get multiple units of affordable housing is through market rate housing. And there are a number of other studies which do show that upzoning does increase the price of land, but as you amortize that across multiple units on that property, you provide more affordable housing at different segments of the market.
So I think that we can all agree that there's a housing shortage. Do you also both agree that that was largely brought on by local zoning and the approvals of development, or what role do you think the local zoning has played in creating a housing shortage?
I think it's played a big role. Perhaps the only role, right?
Mm-hmm.
In Palo Alto, this year we've approved 55 units. They're not being built yet. Last year we approved 57 units. They're not being built yet. We had a referendum here overturning a senior affordable housing project. You look at our regional housing needs allocation and what we're targeted to do by the state based on job growth and population growth, and we're at 20% year after year. And it's not like that gap goes away; it just adds on to the deficit. The governor has a goal of, I believe, building 3.5 million units by 2025, and I support that goal. The question is how we get there.
Yeah.
But wouldn't the opposing view be that the city just passed a bunch of housing policies that haven't had a chance to take effect yet, like the housing incentive program? There's that number of ADUs has gone up, which you haven't factored into the numbers you just cited. So you're just talking about the multifamily developments the city approved. So, can't city officials say we're doing all these other things and the state kind of hasn't given them a chance to kick in before kind of imposing it? Is that a fair criticism?
Somewhat. So two things. The housing incentive program, the ADU legislation we passed in Palo Alto were largely spurred by state legislation to begin with, right? So the state's saying, hey, you actually need to change your zoning so you actually allow ADUs. Two, on the ADUs, previously we were seeing 4 or 5 per year, these granny backyard studios. Now we're seeing 30 or 40, so it's a 10x, right? So we're actually producing more housing. And then third, those are still a drop in the bucket, right? Even Mountain View next door, which has been producing thousands of units, when its neighbors do nothing, we still have a housing crisis.
And what do you say, Greer, to the argument that local zoning got us into this mess because of the preponderance of R1 zoning and the fact that having so much R1 zoning and restricting it in such a way is pretty much banning affordable housing, banning student housing, banning middle-income housing, anything like that? What role does local zoning play in this crisis? And do you think states should have any kind of oversight over local zoning?
Well, I think the state should be providing incentives to be able to create that housing. I think Palo Alto and surrounding jurisdictions have been starting to make inroads, and I do think that the public opinion on housing is starting to shift as well. People are starting to recognize that we do need more housing, and we're starting to put those policies in place. I think what we really need to have is parity between job growth and housing growth. And I know Mayor Philsett alluded to this and talked about this actually in his State of the City address. The fact that when we are building more offices instead of building more housing and continuing to zone for more offices and allow for more offices to be created instead of housing, that is one of the real impediments to actually being able to get housing done. And so I think the City Council has done well at creating options for housing, but we've taken a few steps back as far as some of the decisions that have happened with this current council regarding office space, such as removing the downtown office cap.
It's actually a downtown cap on non-residential development. Last year we had, I think, 10,000 square feet of office development. This year we have 3,000 square feet. Office growth is not occurring in Palo Alto. And furthermore, downtown we have vacancy rates exceeding 10%, which is approaching recessionary levels. I think this council, previous councils in the community have taken a lot of strong steps to clamp down on office growth and to restrain it with a citywide cap, with an annual pacing mechanism. Now it's time to focus on housing.
Well, the City Council has done a lot to constrain office growth, absolutely, but it's still happening elsewhere in the region. And since the housing crisis is a regional issue, I was just wondering if you think there should be any kind of state policies that tie in restrictions to commercial to creation of housing, so that you don't just build housing and then a bunch more commercial development.
I'm not opposed to that. I think how you actually make that dynamic linkage is probably more complicated than we think. And at the same time, there are other things to consider. That when we build offices, one, it does pay taxes. Two, it does employ people. This is a state of opportunity, and we have to balance that too, right? So even in Palo Alto here, we have really slowed down on office growth, but in 10 years, that's going to be hitting our finances. So there's another side to it too. It's not just that offices create demand for housing. There's a benefit to it as well.
True, but I think when we have 13.7 jobs for every 1 unit of housing being built, that imbalance cannot continue, and that is going to lead to increased affordability issue.
Yep.
So the supply and demand issue is one that I hear very different philosophies on. One saying that if you have enough market rate, there's going to be more affordable housing. That's going to solve some of the problem. The other side says we need to really target affordable housing, make sure that there's funding there, and just focus on that. Can you explain how you both hold your views and kind of what the rationales are for how you land on the supply and demand issue, the supply issue, really?
Sure. So I'll start with saying yes, absolutely. We need to focus on below market rate affordable housing. There's a dire need for that in the state. There's also a dire need for missing middle income housing, right? And so right now in Palo Alto and other communities, for the most part, we're building, what some people say luxury condos or luxury apartments and subsidized subsidized housing. I don't want my community to be a place that is for the super privileged and the super subsidized. I think we actually need to look at housing choices for people across the income spectrum.
Over here.
I don't think housing is about the traditional sort of supply and demand, like Econ 101 type of argument. Of course, we need to increase our supply. I have no problem with the idea that we do need more housing. We absolutely do. But this idea by creating supply, we can meet the demand, and that simple model is going to lower the prices is just not playing out in case studies across the country. And we see areas around the country like Harlem, Brooklyn, Chicago, Los Angeles, where we're upzoning those regions, and actually that is causing affordability to be harmed in those regions and is leading to mass displacement. I mean, Harlem, for a perfect example, has been upzoned, and during the 10 years that have been upzoned, prices have increased by about 58% on rents, which is completely out of whack with what's been happening in Manhattan. The population of African Americans in Harlem have dramatically decreased, and they're on the way of becoming truly the minority of the Harlem region, which of course is not consistent with the rich history that Harlem has had. And this has been seen not just there, but really across the country.
So if upzoning and increasing the supply of housing doesn't affect affordability, what will?
And so I think we need targeted approaches, and this is being confirmed by several studies as well, which I'm happy to provide. But the idea that we do really, because I agree with you, we need more middle-income housing, we need more low-income housing, and we need to do that by working with developers, creating public-private partnerships. I've actually talked with a local developer who's not quite ready to come out public about this, but an idea of having a partnership where the city would be able to use public land, which is also being proposed in CASA, which I agree, the importance of using public land to create housing, but working with developers for cities to maintain that public land as a master lease, work with the developer to actually create the building, and then actually creating affordable housing. And this is an issue we're working on the Human Rights Commission. I'm actually formulating a affordable housing summit that I'll be inviting all the members of Santa Clara County to, and I'm hoping to have this developer there to be able to promote this type of ideas and figure out how can we work regionally, because I totally agree, it is a regional effort that we need to have in order to address the housing affordability issues.
Cool. But getting back to SB 50 for a minute, Adrian, you mentioned that you support SB 50, but you have some reservations and would like to see some amendments.
Sure.
I'd love to hear you just talk about what changes you would like to see in
Sure.
that.
So one, I think we do need to deepen the below market rate deed restricted affordable housing portion of it. So one, for projects under 10 or 20 units, I think that's an important thing to happen.
So like a 15, 20% minimum.
I'm not sure the exact number. And then for the larger projects, see how much we can test it, right? Right now, I think it's 25 or 30% in certain projects. Can it go higher than that? I think that's important. Furthermore, right now there is this determination of what's called jobs-rich areas, which Palo Alto obviously is. And in those areas, I believe that the parking minimums would be 0.5 spaces per unit,
right,
and no maximum on the number of units per acre.
Right.
I think we need a little more fleshing out of what those areas are. I prefer to see them focused around transit and jobs rather than out in a place like Midtown or Crescent Park, for example, or College Terrace.
Mm-hmm. And I know you would probably need to see a lot of amendments if you were to support SB 50. But is there any kind of particular state approach that you favor? And I know you kind of talked in broad strokes about the need to restrict commercial development. But yeah, I was hoping to get a little more specific about the role you think state could play in addressing what is obviously a state issue.
Well, I think the state needs to be able to provide incentives for cities. I don't really.
So really funding. Don't think, so you need to give money to cities that promote housing policies? Is that what we mean?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. We need more funding from the state. I think the fact that SB 50 does not provide any funding for cities, despite the fact that, like the city of Palo Alto, we could see our population increase 4 times under SB 50. And the fact that we're already having infrastructure problems and overcrowding and traffic delays and all that, the fact that SB 50 provides no state funding to accompany that increase in population and density that we're going to see, I think really is the state letting us down.
Okay, I got to push back about this 4 times increase thing. Can you explain? I assume you're referring to the Embarcadero Institute report that predicts a hypothetical model of the entire city getting redeveloped. Isn't that a bit of an unrealistic scenario?
No, absolutely not. I do agree that it's not going to happen overnight, and it is the idea
Over a
behind
century.
the idea behind the Embarcadero Institute report was to be able to show people what are the potential impacts. Now, I agree. I don't think Palo Alto is going to be completely built out. It's not going to be Manhattanized under SB 50. Completely agree with that. But I think it is important for people to understand what are the possible impacts of SB 50. And really, under our analysis, we could have gone further with it. We could have done more of the density bonuses that were there, but we didn't want to make it, I guess, too hyperbolic as you were kind of claiming.
The Embarcadero Institute, is that associated with Embarcadero Media?
It is not.
Just making sure.
You are the secretary for the nonprofit, correct?
Yes.
So, I mean, just commenting on that, yeah, I think, Janata, you made a good point that this study was really, I think, going to the extremes on what is possible. And if we look at legislation like the ADU updates we did, it's really been a trickle of new units happening, even though that legislation applies to the entire city. And so it's sort of this low, small rate of housing development. And assuming SB 50 does go into effect with amendments and through the legislative democratic process, we will see incremental development. And I think it'll be focused near the train stations because that's actually what makes sense. And using terms like Manhattanization, I don't think are helpful. We're talking about 3, 4, and 5-story buildings. This is moderate density near transportation hubs. Our comprehensive plan has a goal of 300 units per year. That's a community set goal. We're averaging about like 50 or 60.
Plus ADUs.
I think that,
Plus 30.
plus ADUs, yeah.
So 80, 90.
I support that goal of 300 units per year. And I want to question you, Mr. Stone, do you support that goal? And if we're not going to build 3 and 4-story buildings near transit, how do we get there?
Well, I don't think this blanket approach to just putting by transit isn't really even going along with the data that we're seeing across the country. I think that the point of having it by these transit stations, at least my understanding of SB 50 and the proponents for it, is that we're trying to move in a non-car direction. But again, the studies coming out across the nation and here in Palo Alto is showing that we're having an increased amount of people owning cars. And like in Palo Alto, our per capita rate of car ownership has gone up 14% in the last 5 years. And that's a trend that we're seeing across the Bay Area. And in addition to that, this idea that low-income people living near transit will not need to own cars, again, coming from the Human Rights Commission and seeing what low-income people need, they need to have cars. They don't have the luxury that we have of working a 9-to-5 job. They work strange hours. That's why the cut to line 22 is going to be disastrous for that community. Mm-hmm. And so when we're thinking about this, we really do need to consider this more holistic view of who does it hurt. And I think SB 50, it helps it helps wealthy people, and it really does harm people in the low-income communities and communities of color.
So I completely disagree. I think if you don't build the housing, that's when you displace people. Then wealthy people just bid up the price of housing, and everyone else gets displaced.
Well, when you what these studies are showing, when you upzone a region, that increases the speculative value of the land, which then increases the price of housing. These developers are going to want to maximize their profits on that housing, which is going to push out low-income people. And we're seeing this trickle-down effect, again, supported by studies and evidence, is not trickling down to those low-income communities.
So I'll just put out there, I think supply and demand do work in the housing market. There's the process of filtering where older, smaller units, places like the Hotel President, eventually become affordable. And that's important. And frankly, when we're not building housing decade after decade, everything is going to be luxury housing.
Well, I'm still waiting for those units to become affordable through time, and it just hasn't happened.
Going back to Adrian's question about how to get to 300, you mentioned you don't think building near transit works for the reasons that people still drive and need cars. So how do you get to 300 if not building near transit? We know what you're against, but how do you get to 300?
Well, I really think the idea of using government-owned land to be able to create housing, especially housing for those more vulnerable communities, is the way to go. I think we can create a lot of housing. Lots? So yeah, city-owned land of parking lots. No, definitely not parks, because that's a part of creating a city that's really worth living in. And parks are just as important to low-income communities. I think there's this narrative.
Everyone always talks about the city being built out, though. I don't know if there's is there a lot of public land that I don't know about that Palo Alto could build housing on?
I'll also point out that I believe it was a year and a half ago during our discussions on the comp plan, we actually removed the opportunity to build affordable housing on parking lots. So we used our local control to zone housing out of publicly owned parking lots. That's a shame.
Yeah.
So I agree. So you would support kind of having that policy be reconsidered and maybe
Yeah, now of course Palo Alto. I mean, that's not to say Palo Alto doesn't need parking lots because for retail they need parking lots. I mean, we're still a car-driven society, but Palo Alto can do better finding publicly owned land to be able to zone, to be able to create actual housing, and like I said, working with developers to create that the ability for the city to maintain title so that we can control affordability going forward, not leaving it into the private market. Because when the market takes it, we've seen what happened in Palo Alto and across the country. When the market's in control, the low-income community loses, very wealthy people win, and that's just how it works.
So Greer, in your opening remarks, you said that you would favor some state incentives for housing. I'm wondering if you could outline what those incentives might be if you don't want the state to impose mandates on local communities.
Well, I can see the state doing something like if you meet a particular housing target, or if you have inclusionary zoning that is at an appropriate range that's actually going to be able to help low-income people. If you can reach those targets, then the state will be able to provide particular funds to you. Of course, I don't know the details as far as what those funds should be and what that inclusionary zoning could be, but I can see more of a state partnership with us on that. I mean, let's give carrots, not sticks from the state.
There is an example of that right now, right? The state is investing billions in the Caltrain corridor. Palo Alto, yes, has to figure out our grade separation issues. But when the state invests hundreds of millions of dollars in increasing rail service so people can take the train to job sites in Redwood City, San Francisco, San Jose, doesn't it make sense that we would build housing near those stations?
Well, I think gambling everything on Caltrain over the next 100 years on this on increased density in those regions is not the way to go. There's a white paper that's come out of LA that's making the same argument as well, a coalition of various cities down there saying if we're just building housing along public transportation that we don't know will be the preferred mode of transportation over the next 50, 60, 100 years, well, we could possibly be creating a greater problem for us at that point. I don't oppose the goals of SB 50. I think the goal of creating more housing is the proper goal. I'm just against the methods of it, and I would rather the state give us no plan rather than a flawed plan that's going to set us back in our housing policy.
So I actually think the best way to prevent things like SB 50 and the state stepping in on local control issues is to actually demonstrate that we're using our local control powers to solve the problems, right? And the state does have a process of RENA where they allocate they estimate populations and they allocate housing, and we routinely miss our targets by a large margin. As I mentioned earlier, those deficits don't go away. They just pile on and on and on.
I have a cool question for Adrian. What more do you think the city can do for housing? Leaving aside SB 50 for a second, I know that it was a priority last year. There were these zone changes passed.
Sure.
It's not so much an official priority this year, but it's still something people talk about a lot. Any steps you think the council should
Sure.
undertake?
I think we do need to look again at the zoning along El Camino, San Antonio, Cal Ave, University, to figure out really how we get multi-story housing built there. I'm talking 3 stories of housing with retail on the bottom. I think that's reasonable. Greer did mention public-private partnerships. I think that's a good way to go in terms of figuring out what is it going to take to actually get developers, whether they're public, nonprofit developers, to actually come in and build that housing. Because right now we have passed some housing regulations. We're not seeing much take up yet. It's pretty new, so we still have to see where that goes. And then finally, we do have a couple big sites. So we're looking at like the Fry's site. We are going to kick off a downtown coordinated area plan next year. Those are also good opportunities to build new neighborhoods with housing, parks, schools, affordable housing, et cetera.
Well, we're going to need to wrap up. This has been a great discussion. I just want to give you guys one final chance to just say something to wrap up your comments. And Greer, why don't we start with you?
Hey, well, again, thank you very much for the opportunity to come out here, and Vice Mayor Fine, I appreciate it. It was a fun discussion. Again, I think the goal of creating more housing is a goal that we all need to have and that we need to work together. But the solutions are going to come from local communities and regional efforts. It should not be mandated from the state. And we've seen time and time again throughout history that trickle-down economics do not work. And this is purely deregulatory, trickle-down housing policies that's really going to harm affordability, not help it.
So I want to see a California and a Palo Alto that has secure, abundant, and affordable housing for people with different incomes and different backgrounds. And to that end, we need to look at solutions. I think over the past couple of decades, housing has really come into a couple of different lenses, whether it's the affordability lens, the social equity lens, the environmental lens. And I think if you look through all those lenses at the housing issues, it really makes eminent sense to build 3, 4, or 5-story apartment buildings near transit. I think SB 50 also proposes strong tenant protections. It proposes stringent affordability requirements, which I'd like to see strengthened even further. And it gets us out of this kind of do-nothing approach where cities are clearly not meeting their goals. We say we care about housing, but when it comes to it, we're not willing to do it. And that is exactly when the state should step in. We don't allow each city to regulate what is taught in schools or, how the police force operates. And I think housing is coming into the same light. And so, while SB 50 certainly is not perfect, I support it because it will produce housing near transit and jobs. And I think that's the way for California to go.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your views today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
That wraps up this edition of Behind the Headlines. If you want to comment on this topic, you can go to Town Square, which is our community forum online. That's at paloaltoonline.com/square. And to stay abreast of Gennadi's reporting on this topic, you can subscribe to Express, which is our daily free email. You can find that at paloaltoonline.com/express. We'll see you next week.